Okay, Avi says hi. All right. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Tada. Good morning. I'm going to stop share. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome, welcome. It's really wonderful to see faces. I don't see a lot of those. So some of you are familiar, some of you are not. So for those of you that I don't know yet, I'm just going to introduce myself and tell you a little bit about myself, and then we'll kind of launch in. My name is Leah Herzog. I am originally from Teaneck, New Jersey. I always tell people I'm from Teaneck before it was Teaneck, because I come from a not religious family, and when I was growing up, I could tell you exactly how many Orthodox families there were south of Cedar Lane, and the number is like 5. My husband, is originally from Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is how he knows Tzvi Koren, formerly the Anchors of Minnesota. I now live in Givat Ze'ev, which is between Ramot and Modi'in. We made Aliyah 14 months ago. Yes, this was a heck of a time to make Aliyah, but extremely glad that I'm here. My background is a combination of teaching and guidance and therapy, and not so much therapy, but guidance and counseling. I have a master's in educational psychology. I have the equivalent of a master's in educational administration. Unfortunately, 2 half doctorates don't make a whole. Oh, well. I bring my passions for Tanakh and psychology to this class. I basically am going to be approaching this class as a text-based class. In other words, we're going to go through text, and we are going to use psychological theories, and psychological theories are writ very large and broadly to illuminate the text. In other words, it's not to reread the text, but it's to basically uncover what I believe is already in there. As Ben Bagbag said, my favorite quote in Pirkei Avot is "Hafoch ba dechol ba," that everything is there. So for me, when I think about psychology, and I think about philosophy, and I think about history, and literature, and kind of all of these what would be called soft sciences, to me, and some of the hard ones, I'm just using other lenses and other glasses to look at the beauty and the depth of something that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created. One technical point about myself is that I have an eye disease and I have almost no peripheral vision, which means that if you put something in the chat box, likely I will not see it. So if there's a question, you have one of 2 options. Option number 1 is that you can unmute yourself and just shout it out and say something, and I'll either, say, okay, hold on a second, or we'll stop and pause and discuss. Option number 2 is that you can shoot me an email. And if you don't have my email, then I will go about trying to share it with everybody. Also, I think Tzvi will have the option to kind of assimilate all of the questions in the chat. I'm also going to do my best to allow for some discussion and questions. Obviously, if this were live in person in the classroom, we'd be able to have a lot more discussion. I think in a Tanakh and psychology type of thing, there should be discussion. I think it's going to be a little bit difficult in the Zoom forum, but we are certainly going to give it our all and give it a try. And yeah, so I think we are going to get started here. I'm going to share screen. I'm going to ask people to mute themselves rather than my muting you. I think that might be a little bit easier. And here we go. Hang on, just gonna move this for the moment, and da-da, da-da. Okay, and now I'm going to hopefully, move it back up. Where'd it go? Oh, it's still there. Excellent. Okay, so welcome to Tanakh and Psychology. This is an augmented version of the source sheet that you got. In other words, this one has little pictures and diagrams and things like that that are not in the Word doc. And if you would like the one with the pictures and the diagrams, that can also be sent to you. And I just, again, want to give a shout out to a former student and now friend of mine, Leah Herzog, who helped me tremendously with the graphics and all of that. And I want to thank Gilly Moore for helping with the whole Zoom process and making me aware of things like lighting and framing and things like that. So it says in Gemara and Sanhedrin, learn Torah from somebody and you quote them, right? Ha'omer b'shem Rabo, that you help bring Mashiach closer. So I hope that I brought Mashiach a little bit closer. Okay, so here we go. When we are talking about information, there are different ways of viewing information. There is, and I have here 3 basic perspectives: the perspective of hard science, soft science, and religion and theology.
On this list, 20.
So when we are looking at information, let's say we're looking right now at the coronavirus, right? We're looking at a matzav of a pandemic. So one way to look at that matzav is through the lens of hard science, meaning objective fact, right? There is a virus. The virus has certain properties. It has cellular properties. It has properties of physics. It has properties of chemistry. It has properties of microbiology. The challenge to us as humans is to figure out those properties, right? Is it droplets? Is it airborne? How far does it go? Is it dependent on heat? Is it dependent on cold? Is it dependent on sun? Is it dependent on longitude and latitude? Is it dependent on age? Is it dependent on pre-existing conditions? Is it a respiratory illness? Is it a pulmonary illness? Is it just a viral illness? Right? All of these questions that we have regarding the hard science of this virus. This virus has affected humans, and by affecting humans, it affects things like economies. These are all data-driven, quantitative, objective ways of looking at this pandemic, right? And we can put them down in numbers, and basically the facts are what the facts are, and there's not really much arguing with the facts. In other words, there's interpretation of the facts, but the facts of chemistry and biology and physics are still the facts of chemistry, biology, and physics. It's up to us to decode them and understand them. And economic implications are economic implications. In other words, if someone is ill and cannot work, then, and after a certain amount of time, then they cannot bring in money, right? If we ground airplanes and we stop tourism, that has an impact on the economy. Right? These are all facts, so to speak, on the ground that cannot be argued with. Another way of looking at the coronavirus and another way of looking at the pandemic is through the lens of what we would call soft sciences or social sciences. These are things that are more subjective and therefore less given to clear measurements. In other words, what in a pandemic, how do people respond? What are the effects on the family? Why do things like domestic violence, depression, anxiety, why do all of these things go up dramatically in a pandemic situation? Is being cut off from seeing other people, right? How does the social isolation affect us? When we look back at this era in history, how are historians going to interpret this era? How are they going to describe it, right? If we think about previous pandemic or international illnesses, let's say the Black Plague, there's a lot that's been written about the Black Plague and how it resulted in movement from rural to urban and then eventually leading to cities and guilds and all of this kind of stuff. But we don't really know because we weren't there and we weren't talking to the individual humans, right? Those are things that are far less measurable. And then when you get into the area, for example, of literature, which is completely written from the perspective of the author, that's far more subjective because it is one person's understanding, and not only an understanding, but it's an interpretation of that understanding. And then you get into postmodernism, and is it only what the author is saying? Is it also what I'm taking away from the author, right? When Nathaniel Hawthorne is reflecting on the Salem witch trials and that whole era in the Scarlet Letter, he's writing it from a certain perspective. When somebody in the 20th or the 21st century is reading it, we're coming at it from a different perspective, get into the issue of multiple truths, et cetera, et cetera. The third way of viewing events or viewing kind of the world is the religious and theological perspective. Very simply put, the coronavirus, this pandemic, is an act of God. It is something from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right? That is a very simple in the sense of, is it an onesh? Is it not an onesh? Is it ikvita de Mashiach? Is it not ikvita de Mashiach? All of these types of perspectives are religious, theological perspectives. Right? Is the current prime minister of Israel an agent of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Is the current prime minister of Medinat Israel, against the wills of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Right? We see this in the papers every single day in a country where religion and state are very much intermingled, that the differences in the perspective, let's say, of Gamzu and the communities that want to open the schools, right? Because on the one hand, you can't stop learning Torah, and on the other hand, you have to be concerned with public safety. So we see these three different perspectives very much in action in our daily lives, and it's really a question of how you view the world. So this course is going to try and fuse those three perspectives with a focus on numbers 2 and 3. In other words, to look at the theories of psychology, to look at the theories of what leads to how humans behave, how humans intersect with the world, and to look at it how the Torah presents it to us, which is obviously a divine and theological perspective, right? Chamisha Chumshei Torah, which come from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Sifrei Nevi'im, which come from the, so to speak, the mouth or the quill of a Navi, but filtered through Nivu'ah, or at the very least Ruach HaKodesh. Take those words and that perspective, reflect on what's going on at the time very briefly, and then bring it into the 19th, 20th, and 21st century and look at what do psychological theories say about how humans behave, how humans interact with both their internal physiological environment plus their internal psychological environment. How do we intersect with other humans and their internal environments? And how do we intersect with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and how do we intersect with our nishamot? And in the world of psychology, this concept of a soul is not something that's a given. And we're actually going to get into that today. And then we're also going to look a little bit at the, I guess, the hard facts on the ground. What was life like then physiologically, and how does that all work? So that's kind of by way of overarching perspective. And now we're going to jump into the text. So I'm going to screen share. What I want to look at today is basically the concept of what is it that makes us human, and where did the whole idea of psychology come from, right? This idea of thinking about how specifically humans behave, intersect, interact with the world around them, including themselves. Okay, I'm going to steer away from animal psychology because that's its own field, and it also doesn't really get into the Tanakh so much. When we talk about Nivu'ah, we'll talk a little bit about animals, we'll talk about the Nachash, we'll talk about the Aton, but I'm not really going to go into that realm. So because I love history and because I feel that information should be contextualized, I want to talk a little bit about what I call a very brief history of psychology. So psychology as a field really began with Aristotle. Here's a bust of Aristotle. By the way, at a certain point, I think all of these guys with beards look pretty much the same, with all due respect to guys with beards, but that's my perspective. So here's Aristotle. Aristotle was Greek, and Aristotle, being a Talmud of Socrates and being the Chavruta of Plato, he's the one who really started thinking about thinking. Whereas as Plato looked more at the nature of existence, Aristotle really reflected on being. It's somewhat of an artificial distinction, but it's an important one. Aristotle is the one who really focused attention on the human mind and how the human mind is what makes humans different and special. In Aristotle's view, there is a prime mover, but after the prime mover created the physical world, he disappeared. And this is one of the things that differentiates between the Rambam and Aristotle. So in Aristotle's mind, there is this divine, this prime mover who created everything. And the top of that everything, and it's unclear whether he even really believed in the gods so much, but whatever it is, we'll talk about the Greek gods in a little while, that it's the human that is the top of the human world. In other words, our world, everything that's not in the realm of the gods, everything that's on this planet, we are at the top. And what makes us at the top, what makes us different, is our minds. And the more we can divorce ourselves from the physical, the more we can get into, quote unquote, pure thought, into the realm of ideas and abstractions. And again, if you hear terms that sound like they're Platonic terms, like ideas with a capital I, that's not coincidental, they're chavrutas. But the more we can divorce ourselves from the physical, and the more we can examine reality, including ourselves, only through the mental, cognitive processes of the mind, the better. And the highest order of human is the philosopher, because the philosopher is pure thought, right? And he writes about the philosopher king and all of that. So from the time of the Greeks, really through the 1800s, the 19th century, psychology was part of philosophy, which is why up until maybe, I'm trying to think, we're in 2020, maybe 40 years ago, the only degree that you could get in psychology, which was not a medical degree, was a PhD, right? You were a doctor in philosophy. And the reason for this is that psychology fell under the rubric of philosophy. And the people who talked about the life of the mind were philosophers, whether it was the Rambam, whether it was Descartes, whether it was Rousseau, whoever it was the realm of the philosophers. In the 1800s, with the rise of industrialization, with the Age of Enlightenment having kind of been firmly planted, with the differentiation between the world of religion and the world of science, and again, historical context is important, people started thinking about humans as another form of animal, right? The fact that Darwin's Origin of the Species was written in the 1800s. Again, these are all things that are coming out of a historical context. That humans are not just creatures of God, we're not just souls, but we're also bodies. And that the brain is not just the seat of spirituality, but it's the seat of other things as well. And people began to look at the brain and the mind through medical scientific lenses. The first of the ones to do this, and I'm going to click on the screen share again, is Wilhelm Wundt, nice German guy. Hang on, where are we here? That's William James. Don't know where Wundt went. I think he's this guy. Somehow things got moved around a little bit. Wilhelm Wundt worked at the University of Leipzig in Germany, and Germany, as we know, in the 1800s was really the seat of the Haskalah, the seat of the Enlightenment movement. And he started researching the mind and the psyche as something that's separate from the body. At the same time, we have Pavlov in Russia. Figured, let me use a little bit of a illustration to lighten up the dead white guy with a beard mode here, that we have Pavlov talking about how humans are really just versions of other mammals like dogs, and that our behaviors are responses, and that our behaviors can be trained. In a way, what Pavlov did is take humans to the opposite extreme of where Aristotle had them, right? For Aristotle, the philosopher, was the very, 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 very top of the kingdom, so to speak. And what Pavlov is saying is like, no, human beings are just mammals. And just like dogs can be trained, and dogs salivate when they, and then they can salivate at the sound of a bell, humans can be trained as well. And then the heirs to Pavlov is most famously our B.F. Skinner in the 1950s, and to some degree even CBT owes some of its roots, and we'll talk about different forms of therapies and different forms of thinking about thinking. But the idea that it's a physical reaction. That's all we are. There are no such things really as love and hate, that these are just the adrenal glands releasing cortisol, releasing other things, the brain releasing its form of opioids, and we interpret these things, right? This is like hard, super hard science, right? All we are chemicals, and what we do is lend meaning and terminology to these chemicals. And so Pavlov is really the polar opposite of Aristotle. In the middle, we have Sigmund Freud in Europe, and we have William James in the United States. So Freud is probably the most famous of psychologists. In many ways, I would say the father of modern psychology, in the sense that we're not just brains, we're not even just minds, but that there is something underneath called the unconscious. We have drives, we're not aware of them. Freud, in a way, kind of sits in between Aristotle and Pavlov, in the sense that, again, he was a physician. Psychiatrists are all physicians. He's coming at it from this medical scientific perspective, right? Humans are bodies, and when things go wrong in the body, it manifests itself. So the first thing that you're going to do is look at the body. But then what he began to realize is that there are certain things that manifest themselves in bodies, like migraine headaches, or even in paralysis of limbs, that have no physiological underpinnings. So he kind of goes back to his philosophical origins and it's like, okay, wait a minute, there's more going on. That clearly there's something that is impacting the body in ways that we cannot detect. And he referred to those as the unconscious. William James is known as the father of American psychology. He is also known as the father of American pragmatism. And William James is the brother of the author Henry James. He is the brother of the diarist Alice James, and he is the son of Henry James Sr., who was a theologian philosopher. So in a lot of ways, William James was the Rambam of his milieu. And what he really talked about was the fusion of psychology, philosophy, and theology, which is, it's kind of how we come at it as modern Orthodox Jews, right? That we look to put together the world of the neshama and the world of the guf, the world of the mind, the world of the body, the world of the spirit. And it's really William James who writes about all of this. So that's kind of a brief history of how we got here. Obviously, very, very brief. You know, I put into 5 pictures things that is studied for years and years and years and years. Okay. Want to look at now the question of how did we come to be, right? How did humans get here, and what is it that makes us human? So I actually want to start with the Greeks and with the Greek view. And what we have here, and somehow it got split up a little bit, but that's okay, is that in the Greek view of how did humans get to be here, we have originally, we have chaos. Chaos is missing from the top of this little chart, I apologize. So there's chaos, right? Tohu vavohu. You're going to see parallels between the Greek worldview and Bereshit at the very, very top, so to speak, and then it's going to differentiate and separate. But the reason I want to start with the Greek view is twofold. Number one, Chazal, we're familiar with this, right? There's ample indication of the intersection between the Greek world and the Jewish world. I actually listened to a podcast the other day about the history of the Hebrew language, and it is amazing how many words we have, particularly in the Mishnah and the Gemara, that come from the Greek, including the word Sanhedrin. I think words that we don't think about, apostropos, pinkas, words that, I'm learning Eruvin now. The Gemara is replete with Aramaic words. Chazal traveled to Alexandria, Chazal traveled to Antioch, Bavel intersected with the Seleucid Empire. There just was tremendous cross-fertilization. And there is even the concept, right, Alexander the Great, who intersected with Shimon HaTzadik, and that there's some midrash somewhere that talks about how Yirmiyahu and Socrates are corresponding with each other, which is, again, whether it actually happened or not is to me almost irrelevant. But the fact that Chazal talk about Yirmiyahu and Socrates in the same breath, and they talk about Plato, they are very much aware of this Greek world. And for a long time, Eruvin is full of the Pythagorean theorem, and it's Chazal basically talking about pi, and there's intersection. And it seems, interestingly, that Chazal are not freaked out by the Greek world, probably because Hanukkah is already behind them, right? So the division between Hellenism and Judaism has been pretty well established. And they're way more freaked out by the Romans and subsequently by the Christians than they are by the Greeks. Right? A lot of the early Midrashim was talking about Satan, is really talking about the enemy from within, who are the later Hellenists and the early Romans, whereas Greek philosophy in its purest form was something that didn't seem to trouble them very much. So in the beginning, there was chaos, and then out of chaos emerged Gaia, which we call Earth, and Uranus, which is, for lack of a better translation, the rest of the galaxy. And then things like the Titans began to emerge. One of these Titans is Prometheus. I'm going to keep scrolling down here. Somehow we lost the rest of the chart. Hang on a second. Don't know where the rest of the chart went. I apologize. But one of these Titans is Prometheus. Prometheus links up with Athena, who is one of the gods, right? Who's kind of the next level down. Here we have it. I put it into writing also. Prometheus links up with Athena. Prometheus forms the human, the golem, out of earth. Athena breathes life into this golem, and then Prometheus gifts the human with fire. But there's a very clear hierarchy, right? We have Gaia and Uranus up at the top. Then we have the world of the Titans. Underneath this, I'm sorry that this got lost, is the world of the gods, Zeus and the whole pantheon. Underneath gods, we have demigods like Hercules, right? People who are the offspring of a god and a human. And then at the very bottom of the hierarchy, we have humans. So in the Greek view, it's an incredibly hierarchical top-down model. There's also tremendous conflict and discord between the Titans, between the gods. Everybody is vying for power. And the Greeks basically are reflecting what they saw in the world around them with this mythology that they created about the gods. The way the Greeks made sense of the world was through this pantheon. I was reading a novel recently, and a line jumped out at me where one of the characters said, character who was a psychologist said that the need for humans to make sense of their world and make meaning in their world is greater than the drive for sex, right? That this sapient need is greater than the sexual need. And that character is basically quoting Alfred Adler, who we'll get to next week. Okay, so our view, right? So this is the Greek view. This is their theology, as it were, right? We have our view of what is it that makes us human. And we're now going to spend some time talking about what is it that makes us human. You know what? Let me take a break for a second here. Are there any questions, comments, thoughts so far? Or should I just continue? Okay, then. I guess I'll just continue.
Can you just tell us where we can get the source sheet if we don't already have it?
That's a really good question. I know that the original source sheet was sent out. I would imagine that Matan has it. Another option is to get my email address from Tzvi. Email me directly and I will be thrilled to send it to you.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Okay, I'm going to hit the screen share again, and here we go. All right. Excuse me, Breshit Perek Aleph. All right, we're going to look first at Perek Aleph, and then if we have time, we're going to get into Perek Bet, but I'm really going to focus right now on Perek Aleph, right? So, Vayomer Elokim Na'aseh Adam b'tzalmenu kidmutenu, right? That this idea, and we're going to talk about all of this in terms of Parshanut. Let us, who's the us, obviously, make humans in our image, in our form, and that this human is basically going to take ownership and rulership of the rest of the animal kingdom. And not only is he going to take ownership and rulership over the rest of the animal kingdom, but he's also going to be using the plant kingdom for his survival, right? Just as a little bit of a shout out to Parashat Shavua, if you, this week when you're reading through Parashat Noach, particularly if you look at Perek Tet, after Noach and his family come out of the Teva, the language of Perek Tet very much mirrors this language, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is basically establishing a new world order, a creation 2.0, as it were, and in some ways repeating this relationship and in other ways augmenting it. And when Noach and his sons come out of the Teva, and particularly the language of Perek Tet before the Ma'aseh of Shem, Cham, and Yafet, really reflects all of Sefer Breshit in a nutshell, I'm sorry, all of Parashat Breshit in a nutshell, but particularly this. So we have, so Hashem says, Na'aseh Adam b'tzalmenu kidmutenu. The question at hand really is, what is the Na'aseh, what is tzalmenu, what is kidmutenu? Vayudu, etc., etc. One, just as an FYI, one of the issues with my vision is that reading is also a little bit challenging for me. So then it continues and it says, Vayivra Elokim et ha'adam b'tzalmo, b'tzelem Elokim bara oto, zachar u'nekeva bara oto. Right? So we have this, the language of Bria, which we're going to talk about. It's Elokim who's doing the creating. Elokim created this thing called ha'adam, right? Vayivra Elokim et ha'adam b'tzalmo, right? That note that it's ha'adam, it's not Adam. And we know that it's ha'adam, meaning the human. And at the same time that Hashem created the human, Hashem created Zachar and Nekeva. And then goes on, Vayivarech, etc., etc. We're not going to go into that. So there are some immediate textual differences that jump out at us when we are comparing the Greek concept of how humans came to be with the Torah concept of how humans came to be. Most notably, that humans are created directly by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? If you can call to mind, and we'll talk about this more next week, that famous image of Michelangelo, right? That the human is created by the touch of the finger of God with this other human. And that's a whole thing in art history. So Hashem created humans. That's number one. Hashem created humans in his image, as opposed to just being created from the ground. And Hashem creates male and female human, not just one human. And then Hashem gives humans his blessing, right? So that there seems to be, right from the get-go, some kind of partnership, and there seems to be divinity. And there seems to be a link between the one God and the human. And there's nothing in between. And to channel, I guess, and to paraphrase, oh my gosh, his name is blanking, Chagai Miskav, Dr. Chagai Miskav from Leah Herzog. Right? It's when you start comparing the Torah with the texts that were extant at its time, whether it's the Greek mythology or the Code of Hammurabi or the Sumerian, Akkadian, cuneiform, whatever it is, that the uniqueness of the Torah jumps out at us. In other words, we're not, very often when we think about putting the Torah in the context of its history, it almost feels like we are secularizing the Torah. But his perspective, and I share it, is it's the opposite. It's that by looking at the Torah, it jumps out at us how different it is and what the Torah is really here to teach us, and how divine it is, that there is nothing between humans and God, that there's one God, not many gods, that one God creates everything, and we are part of that everything. And not only are we part of that everything, we are a unique creation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. To the Ramban at the beginning of Sefer Breshit, which I'm not going to go into, but he focuses specifically on this word Vayivra, Breshit bara, and here Vayivra Elokim et Adam b'tzalmo, b'tzelem Elokim bara oto, Zachar Nekiba bara otam, that for the Ramban, the word, the Shoresh Bet Reish Aleph, teaches about a creation yesh me'ayin, that this is something completely different and unique. For the Ramban, the only moment of yesh me'ayin really is that moment of Breshit bara. And if you read the Ramban, it's amazing that somebody writing in the end of the 1100s, beginning of the 1200s, literally is writing about the Big Bang Theory. That at the beginning there was nothing, and then there was something. And that something was so dense that it actually had no matter. He refers to it as a yesod dak ein bo mamash. And then that yesod dak ein bo mamash exploded into energy and matter, tohu vavohu, and slowly but steadily things took form, and Hashem formed things. So Bria really is that first moment that the universe came into being. That's Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. That everything, all matter, energy, everything was created at that one instant, and everything else is a totseret, is a sculpting, is a forming of that matter. So what are we doing here with this word? Vayivra Elokim et Adam b'tzalmo b'tzelem Elokim bara oto. Right? We have twice in one pasuk, qualifies as a milah mancha. So what the Ramban says is that Adam, that the humans are somehow a bria chadasha. That while our bodies may have come from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that there's something different about us, namely our nishamot and possibly our minds that are different. So what is it exactly that's different? So we're going to scroll down now. And I'm going to leave Perek Bet for the moment. We'll talk about Adam 1 and Adam 2 next week. And we're going to go back to the Greeks for a second, right? So in the Greek mind, psyche was something separate. Psyche was a human or a demigod? Kind of unclear who or what Psyche was, but Psyche was certainly something that was separate from the individual human. Psyche was a very beautiful woman. The goddess Aphrodite or Venus was jealous of this beautiful woman. She sent Cupid, who was one of the gods, or Eros, one of the gods, shot his arrow into her. She fell in love with Cupid or Eros. It was, one of these doomed loves, and out of the union of Cupid and Psyche, of mind and lust, or beauty and lust, comes some pretty bad humans. So this is a cautionary tale for the Greeks of, number one, humans should not be competing with gods. Number two, when humans try to ascend to the world of the gods, bad things happen. Again, a very, very different model. We'll talk way more about love and things like that as we get further along into the course. I just wanted to bring up this model. So now let's get into the parshanut of what, in the Jewish view, in the Torah view, what is it that makes us distinctly human? And by human, I mean different from all other mammals, semi-divine and semi-physical. Right? So we start off with Rashi. I'm going to skip over the Musar Shmuz that he does at the beginning, but the famous Rashi here, that what does it mean when Hashem says, Na'aseh Adam, Lefi Adam b'demut hamalachim. And we tend to kind of gloss over these words, because then we get into the whole thing about how HaKadosh Baruch Hu is trying to teach us humility and talk to the malachim. But these words that Rashi is quoting from the Reshit Rabbah are pivotal words. In the view of the Talmud, we are somehow angelic. Part of us is part malach. Question now becomes, what is a malach? The way I understand everything that I have learned about malachim, the word malach means messenger, and a malach is a messenger of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. If you want to think about it in 20th, 21st century language, a malach is a computer program that HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates and hits the run button, and then the malach goes and does what HaKadosh Baruch Hu programs it to do. In a more scientific model, I think of malachim as the pseudopods of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? That HaKadosh Baruch Hu is this giant amoeba, and little pseudopods form. The pseudopods break off or extend and do their thing, and then return to the mothership. In any case, malachim are functionally extensions of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We conceptualize malachim as separate, right? And dibra Torah b'lashon Adam, it's the only way we really can conceptualize them. But really, malachim are emanations of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is why nivu'ah often comes through a malach. The Rabbeinu Bachaye talks about at the beginning of Sefer Shemot how a malach, when the Torah says, right, that Moshe, for example, saw a malach, or that Hagar saw a malach, whatever it is, that a malach is kind of a low level of nivu'ah. Yes?
Eso termina menos 25.
Is somebody asking a question? No. Okay. Well, we're going to move on. So humans are in fact part malach. We are formed in the demut of a malach, and that there is somehow a tension between the worlds of the humans and the world of the malachim. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows this. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu basically onboarded the malachim, and he said, Na'aseh Adam b'tzalmi. Right? Obviously it's b'tzalmi, but the lesson here is clear. And Rashi makes that lesson very clear at the end, right? And the yesh makom leminim liradot, and even though we are opening up the doors for the minim, and when Chazal talk about the minim, they are referring to the early Christians who are really trying to bring down Judaism. So even though this language of Naaseh seems to indicate, oh wait, the Jews say that they have one God, but look, they're lying and they have multiple gods, and what's their issue with us when we talk about God the Father and God the Son, and what's their issue with you, the Romans, when you talk about a pantheon? Look at them, they're really lying when they say they only have one God, they have more than one, excuse me. So the Midrash and Rashi here, living in very Catholic France on the eve of the Crusades, in his drasha to his people, is saying the same thing, that the Torah, even though it kind of leaves room for the minim to come along and say, oh yes, there are multiple gods, still it is the Lashon of Naaseh. Why? To teach us derech eretz, right? To teach us that the way that you run things is to some degree in collaboration with the people that you're working with. Really tremendous lesson that Rashi draws out here, right? Aval pi shelo siyuhu, even though these malachim didn't actually help Hashem, right? B'yitzirato yesh makom, and v'yesh makom, and even though we're opening up the doors for heretics, lo nimna hakatuv mililamed derech, and it should say derech eretz. I'm sorry that got cut off. Right? So that, and then Rashi continues and he explains, what does it mean b'tsalmenu, b'defus shelanu, in our form, kidmutenu, and he says here that habina, lahavin ulahaski, that what does it mean to be in the tselem and the demut of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? It means somehow to be angelic, whatever that means, and it also means to have seicha. So our ability to think, and specifically to think abstractly in the view of the Midrash, in the view of the Tanaim, and as brought down by Rashi in amongst the Rishonim, is that which makes us distinctly human. And then the Rashbam continues, and very interestingly, the Rashbam echoes his grandfather, right? Usually the Rashbam disagrees with his grandfather, so that when the Rashbam agrees with his grandfather, it's noteworthy. And he says the same thing. Bitsalmenu kidmutenu, ki yidme l'shnehem, sorry, I have to move in a little bit closer, b'matkonet gufo la'aretz, asher lukach mimenu, ve'yidme beruach le'elyonim. Right? That somehow what he does here is a little bit different. I'm sorry, I think I just read the Ramban, my bad. We're going to move back up here to the Rashbam. I knew something sounded weird. Okay, B'tsalmenu, B'tselem HaMalachim, right? Rashbam here is echoing his grandfather, Kidmutenu, and here he says, Be'inan Chachmatenu, right? That the thing that makes us human and different is our chokhmah. And he goes so far as to say, he continues and he says that when our chokhmah is mikulkal, it is broken, there's something wrong with it, that's when we end up going back to becoming animals, right? So the thing that makes us different than the rest of the mammalian kingdom, the thing that makes us specifically, uniquely human, is our mind, is our ability to think and think abstractly, and to evaluate and to analyze, and all of the things that have to do with the life of the mind, to learn, but not just to learn, really to think, because we know that animals learn also. The Ramban picks it up from there, and he says, what does it mean, B'tsalmenu kidmutenu? Ki yidme lishnehem b'behema gufo and to Elyonim in Nishmato. So that the Ramban starts talking about, and he says it very clearly, that humans are part animal, right? We are created on the 6th day of Breshit. We are created right after Behemot and Chayot. And just like Behemot and Chayot are created from the Aretz, so too, when Hashem says, Na'aseh Adam, according to the Ramban, he's actually talking to the Aretz. He's not talking to the Malachim, which is really interesting. In that way, the Ramban is, if anything, taking his cue, possibly, again, from the Greeks, that we are formed in collaboration with the ground, right? That the golem, the glima of humans is exactly that. It's ground. I mean, it's also Perek Bet, right? Vayitzar Elokim et Adam afar meha adama. That humans are created from dirt. What that means is that we are corporeal, physical beings. We are corporeal, physical beings that are governed by the rules of science. So that we are body, meaning we are atoms and molecules and carbon and oxygen and iron and all of that. And again, to go back to the virus, and when some other form of chemistry and physics gets in the way of the chemistry and the physics of the human body, things go really awry. Now, why that happens is to some degree rules of science, and to some degree the hand of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And where you fall on that continuum is a philosophical question and a theological question, right? If you ask the Ari, who says that any fly lands on a given blade of grass because that is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's direct intervention, he would tell you that the reason this person gets ill and that person doesn't get ill is because that is what Hashem has decided. It is a direct link between the finger of God and the workings of the human. The reason the virus works the way it does is because that is how HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants it to work. Right? It's a pretty deterministic type of approach. And yet there are a lot of people who subscribe to it, and I am not arguing with it. The opposite approach would be the approach of the Rambam, which is very close to Aristotle, which is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created a world, created rules of science, let that world go into motion, and kachazeh. And hashkacha for the Rambam, particularly after Churban Bayit Rishon, when we lose nivu'ah, we also lose this one-on-one hashkacha pratit, and there's very little in the Rambam's view of one-on-one hashkacha pratit. Hashkacha is much more on a le'umi level, the caveat being that what I do as an individual goes into that pot of the ummah, and therefore I can never divorce myself from it, because I don't know if my individual actions will tip the scales on the ummah. There is hashkacha pratit, there is sachar va'onesh, most definitely, but it's not on a direct cause and effect type of level. But again, that's a course in the Rambam and comparing the Mishneh Torah to the Moreh Nevuchim. The Malbim, who just by the way is pretty much my favorite Parshan, the Malbim, who is a philosophical descendant of the Ramban and the Abarbanel, both of whom he quotes all the time, takes it a little bit further, and he says that what does it mean, the tselem, inyan hatselem, right? Vayivra Elokim et Adam b'tzalmo, b'tselem Elokim bara oto, right? That is specifically hakoach hasichli, that thing that makes us godlike is our seichel. Again, in that Aristotelian, Maimonidean, Abravanelian world, the koach haseichel is above and beyond everything else. And the koach haseichel eventually, in its most pure and rarefied form, merges into the koach hanevuah. So that Adam Harishon is not necessarily the first Homo sapien. And here I credit Dr. Gerald Schroeder in his book, The Genesis and the Big Bang. So Adam Harishon is not necessarily the first humanoid, not necessarily Homo erectus, Homo authropillicus. I think I just totally messed up that word. Not Cro-Magnon, not Neanderthal, and maybe not even Homo sapien. He wasn't the only humanoid at that point on the planet. What he was is the first human. Adam and Chava were the first humans that could so conceptualize what is beyond the physical to the point that their own spirit, this is the Malbim's explanation, that their own spirit practically left their bodies and was able to communicate with the divine as humans communicate face to face, voice to voice. This is what we call nivu'ah. So that Adam, that first Ha'adam, the Adam that HaKadosh Baruch Hu spoke to, Pru u'revu u'mil'u et ha'aretz v'kivshuha, right? Mikol ha'etz bagan tochal. That Adam was not the first Homo sapien, but that Adam was the first Homo sapien sapien. That there is a higher level of humans that where the mind is greater than the body, and that the mind and the spirit work together to communicate with the ultimate spirit, who's HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is, I know that this is, a somewhat, no pun intended, mind-bending concept, and, it's not necessarily the only perspective, and I'm not portraying it to be the only perspective, but this is the way I understand it. And thus, the thing that makes us human is specifically our minds. But in the Torah view, the mind and the soul are together. They're not separate things. Cognition and the neshama might be separate functions. And we'll get more and more into that as we get into drives and motives and things like that. But that which makes us human in the view of the Torah is our neshamot, right? And what is our neshama? Our neshama is specifically that which allows us to think. I want to get a little bit further down here. Rav Shimshon Rafal, I'm sorry, I meant to continue here, right? Shehi, this is continuation of the Malbim here, that Shehi Teva HaSichliim HaNifradim Kemo Shekatuv HaRadak, and he quotes the Radak, like that. It is our ability to think that makes us separate, right? Shekvar noda shekol ha'olamot hem ha'achadim be'ish echad. And what the Malbim here is referring to is another concept, which we didn't talk about so much yet, which is that human beings are considered a miniature world. The Gemara talks about the Olam Gadol and the Olam Katan. Right? We say the one who saves a human life saves a whole world. This is a very deep and profound concept in the Talmud. It's a Kabbalistic concept. That each human being is an Olam Katan. And again, what makes us an Olam Katan is that the human being has the same potential in the Olam HaTachtonim, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has in the Olam Ha'elyonim. And again, this goes back to the words Vayivra Elokim et Adam b'tzalmo, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu put this ability for B'ri'ah, for almost a yesh me'ayin, in human hands. Obviously, we can't do yesh me'ayin because the only yesh me'ayin is in God's hands. But if we compare, for example, right, the human ability to innovate with even the most sophisticated animal abilities, whether it's the ability to build a nest, whether it's the ability to navigate, whether it's the ability to communicate with sonar or with radar, or even amongst the highest primates, right? The bonobos, the chimpanzees, the great apes, who clearly have rudimentary societies, rudimentary by human terms, who clearly have sapience, who clearly have forms of language and communication. As humans, our ability to innovate is unique. And our ability to innovate in the physical lower world is as great as HaKadosh Baruch Hu's ability to innovate. And by great, I don't mean as broad, but I mean as kind of qualitatively great. We can, the fact that human beings can go to the moon, the fact that we have invented machinery that can splice atoms, can conceptualize atoms, that can, just think about what humans can do, for better and for worse, right? We don't always use those abilities benevolently. Witness the atom bomb, witness germ warfare, we think of really creative ways to destroy each other and destroy the planet, as well as we come up with vaccines and things like artificial hearts and desalinization plants, so that we're not permanently on the brink of extinction in the Middle East from drought, right? That in itself is something remarkable. So what we are considered an olam katan. So again, what makes us human is not just our ability to think and learn and conceptualize, but our ability to think and learn and conceptualize and do it in ways that are creative and are new, right? And the ability to create is what makes us B'Tselem Elokim, and it's exactly what we don't do on Shabbat. Right? The definition of melacha is creative work. The thing that makes us human and almost divine is exactly that thing that we need to stop doing once a week to acknowledge the power of the divine. That we, again, let's stop and think about that. Ki sheshet yamim asa Hashem et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz uvayom hashvi'i shavat v'inafash. And then, that's it. That's the source of Zachor Yom HaShabbat B'Kadsho. That we need to step back, because if we don't, then we end up arrogant and we end up with hubris. And again, we'll talk about arrogance and hubris at a later point. Right now, we're just talking about that thing that makes us uniquely human. And then it's I'm sorry, I skipped Rav Hirsch, my bad. Rav Hirsch adds yet another element to what it is that makes us human. And it's not just our ability to think and to be spiritual and to be sapient and to be creative, but he adds something very important. He says, "Hachesed v'harachamim." Kol ha'emet v'hamishpa v'hakdusha shel hanhagat Hashem. That not only is it our ability to rule and to conquer and to create and to manage, but part of that also is to evaluate and to judge, right? That's the Elokim. But part of it is also Vayitzer Adonai Elohim et ha'adam, is that ability to be moral, right? And that's the lesson of the Nevi'im over and over and over and over again. Ma Hashem doresh mimcha, right? Hatznei alechet im Elokecha. Avat mishpat, avat chesed, that we should be benevolent and lemala min hateva and lifnim mishurat adin, and that pshara is really what tzedek is all about. And again, the Rav Hirsch is writing also in a historical context, which we'll talk about more next week. But this is another key piece of what is it that makes us distinctly human, is to go beyond the letter of the law, to go beyond the black and white, and to evaluate and think about how does this impact the morality around us. I'm going to okay, and I'm going to finish off with the Malbim again, which is, what does it mean? Naaseh Adam mitzayin gemer tikuno mitzad kohot gufo kefi shehurkav hanefesh hanivua v'koach habechira. That the final thing that makes us uniquely human, and you guys can read the rest of the movie, he adds a couple more things to the mix. If whoever is not muted, if she can mute herself, that would be great, just so I can finish up.
עוד 5 דקות זה ייגמר.
Okay.
תודה.
So that what the Malbim says is that finally, and he finishes up, and again, the Malbim and the Netziv and Rav Hirsch are all living pretty much at the same time. They're all writing at the same time. Fun fact, the Malbim and the Rav Hirsch, there's no evidence of any correspondence between them, and yet often they end up writing almost verbatim the same thing because they're both students of the Ramban. Malbim really considers the Abarbanel his Rebbe, more than Rav Hirsch, but
דוקטור לויט?
just so finally,
Okay.
just to finish up, the thing that makes the human human, in addition to everything else, is the ability to choose. And that ability to choose will come into play. We'll talk about it way more 2 weeks from now when we start getting into the Eitzadat Tovara, is the ability to choose between right and wrong, good and bad, to evaluate what's right and wrong. So just to summarize in a sentence, in the Torah view, the thing that makes us human, what gives us what in Greek is called the psyche, is our neshama. Our neshama is a piece of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So effectively, it is our very divinity in mortal coil, to quote Shakespeare, that makes us human. Any questions that people have, please send to me. I know that Matan has my email. You can add, Tzvi would have my email, Oshra, the office, whatever. They also have my phone number. I give my permission for you to contact me by WhatsApp. And I thank everybody very much for their attention, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Be well.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing everybody again.
שבוע טוב.
Shavua Tov. I hope so. I don't know.